So my name is Frank Hiley, and I'm going to describe a model of the brain and consciousness that explains spirituality and spiritual enlightenment, and duality is a synonym for spiritual enlightenment. I'm writing a book about this. It's taking a long time, but the tentative title of the book is Spirituality Explained. And to explain spirituality, I first have to define spirituality, and I have an equation for that. Spirituality equals religion minus dogma. So if there's a book that has to be believed, every word of this book is the truth and you've got to believe it, that's an example of dogma. So you got to subtract that dogma from the religion, and what you have left is the spirituality that the religion is really talking about. Now, spirituality will cultivate various positive values like love and forgiveness, and it has practices like prayer and meditation to achieve those goals. My hypothesis is that spirituality began around 40 to 100,000 years ago when human consciousness changed. And the reason I chose those numbers, 100,000 and 40,000 years ago, is that about 100,000 years ago, humans began to bury their dead intentionally. And about 40,000 years ago, we started making figurines that could be interpreted as a Venus or a fertility goddess, something like that. So that's the evidence that some kind of spirituality or religion started around that time. Now, this change in consciousness was facilitated by the development of modern language. And my model is that, 6 million years ago when we departed from the apes, we probably had 50 or 100 words in our language. And gradually over the long period of time, that increased slowly. But when you have more words, it's easier to create additional words. And there was an exponential growth around that time of 40 to 100,000 years ago. So that's what caused it. And language is really only the input-output mechanism for the true cause of change in consciousness, which is the development of conceptual worlds. And it started out being a conceptual model of the real world. Take this stone, hit it on this stone, and you get a flake, which is a good knife. But around that time, I believe it crossed over into creating an entire conceptual world full of mostly abstract concepts. So there isn't any, most of the words that we're talking about are not talking about physical objects out here in the physical world. They're abstract concepts. And this changed who we are. The ancient human would have identified totally with the body. I'm the body. The modern human identifies with the conceptual self. I call that the I, me, my. This is the autobiographical narrative history of me and everything I want to do and things like that. Now, this conceptual world did wonderful things. It created science and technology, and everything we have around us here is a result of that conceptual world. But the conceptual self model caused suffering for the individual human. And spirituality is the cure for that suffering caused by the conceptual world self-model. I'll tell you more about that later. Now on to a different topic, agents. An agent is an entity that has goals, that has a way of sensing the world, and has a way of changing the world to try to achieve those goals. So a human being like me is an agent. I'm an agent. I'm actually trying to dump my conceptual model of this thing into your heads right now. That's my goal right now. So now there's a theory from control systems theory in 1970 which says that every good regulator of a system must be a model of the system. Now this is actually saying that every agent needs to have a model of the world. So I'm a human being and I am an agent, and therefore, and I'm a good agent, I achieve my goals. That means I need to have a model of the world inside of my brain here. So if the agent itself is part of the world, if the agent, for example, my body is part of this world here, and in fact I use my body to try to achieve the goals, that means that my body has to be part of the model of the world that is created by my brain, and that body becomes identified with who I am. So that's a self-model. My body would be the self-model of me in this world. Now the question is, do we live in the world directly, or are we self-models living in our model of the world? Well, if you look at the body in the world is really the same as the self-model of the body living in the model of the world. You couldn't really tell the difference between those two because they're supposed to map onto each other very accurately. That's what the good regulator theorem says. However, the conceptual self doesn't exist out in the real world. Concepts only exist in my model of the world. Therefore, that would say that we are human self-models living in a model of the world. Now, this may not be convincing to you, so let me ask another question. Do we experience the real world, or do we experience our model of the world? Colors can help answer that question. The way colors work is that there are 3 different kinds of photoreceptors. Each one detects a different wavelength of light, And the information from those three kinds of photoreceptors are sent to the brain. That's essentially giving three black and white images to the brain. The brain takes those black and white images and constructs this. The colors that you're seeing there are not out in the physical world. All that's out in the physical world is lights of different wavelengths. This is constructed by our brain to help us understand what's happening in the world. This is part of the world model that we're experiencing here. Further, what we experience is not what we perceive. For example, with a visual system, I would say perception is the information that the eye is sending to the brain. That would be the perception of the world. That's not what we experience. And the reason for that is that visual acuity drops off rapidly from central vision. So if you have 20/20 vision, that's only at the center of vision in your eye. If you move off to the side, it will drop off dramatically, and out here you're legally blind, essentially, even though you think you can see all the way out to here. To prove that, take a look at my face right now. I hope you can see my eyes, ear, nose, mouth. Maybe you can even see my glasses. Now shift your vision 45 degrees to the right or left, and use your peripheral attention to try to pay attention to me. I bet that all you see is a blob for the head and a bigger blob for the body. You don't see any eyes, ear, nose, or mouth. That's an example of how bad your peripheral vision is compared to your central vision. So when we look out at a scene like this, and let's say you're keeping your vision on that house in the center there, you still see the other houses around there, and then you see me standing over here, and you see the rest of this room here. And that all looks nice and crisp, as if it's a real world out here. However, what the eye is sending to the brain is something more like this. It gets blurrier and blurrier the further you are away from the central vision. And further, there's a blind spot. Now, you might say, well, we don't see the blind spot because it's in different positions in the two eyes, so one eye can fill in for what the other eye is blind in. But if you close one eye, you still don't see the blind spot. So what we are experiencing is this, and the reason we're experiencing this is because we are experiencing our model of the world. Our model of the world is that it's crisp all the way out to the edge. Even if our brain doesn't know exactly what's out there, it's going to model it as being crisp. So the bottom line is, we are self-models living in and experiencing our model of the world. That's who we are. Now I'm going to explain the three-agent model with this diagram. And so the overall human brain is divided into three different agents: the experiencer, the thinker, and the doer. And the experiencer is the one that creates the model of the world required by the good regulator theorem. And it has both the sensory representation of the world and a conceptual representation of the world. Now, there isn't really a dividing line between them because the visual system is creating concepts all the way through analyzing data, going from the lines to surfaces to objects, all the way up to the highest level object, which is probably the I, me, my construct, is probably the highest level conceptual object that I have. Now, I say that there's both a representation and a model here. The representation means the current state of the world the way it is right now. The model is a way to predict what future states of the world would be if I performed this action versus if I performed that action. The doer is the agent that controls the body, and it has emotions. It has emotions and feelings, it generates those, and it has complete control of the body. The thinker is a problem solver. And the reason that evolution produced a problem solver like our thinker is that it can fill in when the doer is not able to solve the problem of meeting his goals. If the apple is too high in the tree, I can't quite reach it, the doer gives up. The thinker says, oh, if I go and pile these rocks over here, I can climb up on the rocks and reach the apple. So that's what the thinker does. Now, this diagram shows the major connections, and there are also some other connections between these agents. The thinker generates the inner voice that we hear in the experiencer. The experiencer hears the inner voice as if it's somebody else talking to it. And the doer's feelings and emotions are also experienced by the experiencer. The experiencer experiences everything. The thinker and the doer can tell the experiencer where to direct attention. When you looked away 45 degrees, that was your thinker telling your eyes to look away 45 degrees. And finally, the experiencer can use bottom-up attention to bring unexpected events to the attention of the doer, so it can handle it. If there's a loud noise, it'll bring bottom-up attention there. Now, unfortunately, 20 minutes is not long enough to give you the full model here. So if you want to get the full model, go to my website, and I have some videos there that will explain the full model in detail. And I don't have time here to talk about the goals of the agents, about the thinker's suffering, the thinker causing suffering. The hint I'll give you is that to a problem solver, everything looks like a problem. And then how spirituality cures that problem. How does spirituality, ordinary spiritual practices, cure that problem of the thinker? So take a look at my website, and when you're there, sign up for updates, and I'll send you an email when I add new content to the website or when I finally publish my book. All right, so the thinker and doer are consistent with well-established experimentally derived models of cognition. For example, in the field of psychology, dual process theory has a system 1 and system 2 that correspond exactly to the thinker and doer. And in neuroscience, there's an action-outcome system and a stimulus-response system that, again, correspond to the thinker and the doer. And I have some references at the bottom there. Now, given a thinker and a doer, you need to have an experiencer according to the good regulator theorem. So you got to have an experiencer. And it doesn't make sense to have two different world models for the thinker and doer. Have one world model that's shared between the two of them. Now I'm going to define two terms. A body schema is a model of the body. So this includes the angles of all the joints in my body, the size of my body, and what I'm feeling with my body right now. An attention schema is a model of our current state of attention. And we can pay attention to a lot of different things. We have 5 different senses that we can pay attention to. We have the inner voice from the thinker that we can pay attention to. We can pay attention to the feelings coming in from the doer. And you can imagine things in your brain that you're also paying attention to those things that you're imagining. And you can pay attention to more than one thing at a time. And the attention schema is the model of that. It's not the actual attention itself. It's the model of where I am paying attention in the world and how I'm paying that attention in the world. Now let's look at the effect of attention on world models. If this is the world that we're looking at, actually we're looking at the model of the world, remember, but there's a real world that somehow maps onto this model of the world that we're seeing here. If we keep our eyes on that center house there, and then we move our peripheral vision first to the right, and then to the left, and then just back to the center alone, did the world change? No. Did our model of the world change? No, because it's supposed to always map to the world. What did change is the current representation of the world that we have in our brain. And that looks more like this. When we're looking at the central house there, it's like there's a spotlight of attention on that central house that lets us see all the details of the central house. When we shift the attention to the right, you get some there. When you shift it to the left, you get some there, and you're back to the center. So the current representation of the world changes as we move attention around the world. So to keep the world model invariant, there must be a way that you can combine the attention schema with the current representation of the world to come up with that invariant world model that doesn't change. And that leads to the world model equation, which says that you take the attention schema combined with the current representation of the world, that gives you the world model. In pictures, it would look like this. Now, if this is hard to believe or hard to understand here, think of it this way. If I've got a world model already, and I've got the attention schema, I could compute where the highlight of attention is going to be in that world and to figure out what the current representation of the world will be. So you just invert that function and you get the world model as a function of the other two. Now let's take a look at the self-models of the agents. So the self-model of the thinker is the I, me, my concept. The self-model of the doer is the body. Now the experiencer, you might think, doesn't need to have a self-model because it doesn't do anything out there in the external world. All it's doing is taking information in from the world. However, the experiencer does change the internal world. And the way it changes that internal world is through the attention. So the attention that the experiencer directs to different things changes that current representation of the world, just as we saw in those previous foils. And the way, the representation of who the experiencer is in that world model is exactly the attention schema. Because the attention schema is saying this is what the experiencer is currently paying attention to. And so that is the way that the experiencer is modifying the world model, the current representation of the world. And so the attention schema is exactly the self-model of the experiencer. And the human self-model will be some combination of the other agents. Now, I'm going to talk about attention schema theory. This is a theory proposed by neuroscientist Michael Graziano from Princeton. And this is a theory that explains awareness, the subjective awareness that we experience. Everything I show you on this slide is from the paper that's referenced here. In fact, as figure 1A and B is what I'm going to talk about. And he's got a very long caption that describes that figure. I tried to summarize it in a little bit of text over on the left side here. So we'll go through this pretty quickly. So first of all, when you just have visual attention, all that is information coming in from the world into your brain. Information is not the experience of awareness. Now, he claims that in order to have subjective awareness to the current representation of the world, you need to add the self-model of the human and the attention schema. You need those three things. It's the self-model, the attention schema, and the current representation of the world. And in fact, the attention schema is kind of the connector between the self-model and the current representation of the world. So the human and the apple here are connected by the attention schema. In an equation, you would say that the overall model of awareness is the self-model combined with the attention schema, combined with the current representation of the world. Before we go on, if you consider the experiencer, the thinker, and the doer as separate brains, let's say they were three separate brains instead of one brain, attention schema theory would say that only the experiencer is conscious. Because it's only the experiencer that has an attention schema and has a current representation of the world. The thinker and doer don't have that. In fact, the thinker and doer are incomplete agents if they don't have the world model of the experiencer attached to them. So the thinker and doer are only conscious when they're attached to the experiencer, and the experiencer is the real source of all awareness and all consciousness that we have. So now let's apply this awareness model to the three agents. So for the thinker, the self-model is I, me, my. So if the thinker was expressing it in words, he would say that I, me, my am aware of the apple. So those are the three parts there. The doer, if he's expressing it in kind of feelings or sensations, it's the body aware apple. And that's not in words, that's the feeling of being aware of the apple. So that's the feeling, the subjective feeling that we have. Now the experiencer's self-model is the attention schema. So if you plug that into the equation there, you would get attention schema combined with attention schema combined with the current representation of the world. I presume that attention schema combined with attention schema is an attention schema. And you end up with attention schema combined with the current representation of the world. That is exactly the world model from that previous equation. So this is saying the way that the experiencer experiences awareness in the world is presented by the world model. In other words, the experiencer paying attention to awareness is the world model. It's synonymous with the world model. Now, I'm a dual person, and a non-dual person has to try to describe this to us. Maybe they would just say world model. Maybe they would just say aware apple, because there's no me that's aware of apple. I'm just aware of apple. Or maybe world aware of apple. I don't know. But it's something like this. So let's rewrite this same chart here, treating them each as a conscious agency, because awareness is the most important fundamental aspect of consciousness. So if we're looking at the thinker, the doer, and experiencer from conscious agent point of view, a TC, DC, and EC, these are the three statements that they would make about that. Now let's look at the overall human self-model. My claim is that the normal, modern, non-spiritual human, if you ask him who he is, oh, I'm Frank. And that's the name for my self-model. That's my I, me, my self-model. His name is Frank. So they would completely identify with that conceptual model themselves. And that makes what the thinker says and does very important. So that inner voice, that's me talking. I better believe it. It's 100% true. The goals the thinker has, oh, you got to pay attention to those. Forget those doer goals. Don't worry about that. So the thinker becomes all important for the normal modern human. And that's the suffering that we get from that. Now, with some spiritual practices, just say prayer and meditation, something like that, you might get some of the experiencer and the doer self-model mixed in with the thinker self-model. And in fact, for the spiritual traditions, the experiencer would be the connection to God. If you have a prayer and you ask God for something in a prayer, the answer comes from intuition. Intuition comes from the experiencer. So that's the connection to God. With more spiritual practices, you might actually mostly experience that you're an experiencer with a thinker and doer mixed in. And then finally, when you become fully enlightened, you would be an experiencer only. So this would be the model of enlightenment is about. And so in terms of the conscious models, the thinker consciousness is the normal modern human who identifies with the thinker. The experiencer consciousness is the enlightened human that identifies with the experiencer. And animals and the ancient humans would have identified with the body, and they would have a doer consciousness. So there'd be the three extremes of consciousness. The two states in the middle are some mixtures of all those. So we're probably all mixtures right here in this room. Now let's look at how some of the traditions describe enlightenment, the features of enlightenment. In Buddhism, they say that there's no self. Well, for the thinker and the doer, there certainly is a self. For the experiencer, when it's experiencing the world, it's just the world model. There isn't anything separate from the world for the experiencer. So the experiencer gets a check mark there. In the Hindu Advaita Vedanta tradition, they say that the subject-object distinction is an illusion. There is no subject-object distinction. For the thinker and doer, there sure is a subject-object distinction. There's the self-model here, and there's the thing I'm aware of, and there's the attention schema linking the two together. For the experiencer, there isn't any. The subject disappeared from those experiencer awareness models. They also say that Atman equals Brahman, and Atman is defined as the true self or the soul of the human. So if you're a thinker, your true self is the thinker-self model, and that certainly isn't equal to the world. But by the way, Brahman is the whole world. So it's saying that my soul is equal to the entire world. That's what Atman equals Brahman means. That's certainly not true for the thinker and doer, but for the experiencer it's true, because its self-model is the attention schema, and when it's aware of the world, it's the entire world model, and that's what Brahman is, the entire world model. And finally, there's a spiritual tradition called self-inquiry, where you keep asking yourself, who am I? Oh, I'm Frank. No, I'm not Frank. I'm the body. No, I'm not the body. When you finally get down to the ultimate answer to that question, that's when you become enlightened. And a non-dual teacher, John Wheeler, his answer to this question of who am I is presence awareness. In fact, he has a book that says, presence awareness, just this and nothing else. That's the answer to who am I. Now, the presence he's talking about there is not the presence of my body in the world. It's kind of the fundamental, subtle presence of me that I feel whenever I'm experiencing something in the world as a non-dual person. Now, if you could map the current representation of the world to awareness, and that makes a reasonable map, the current representation of the world is awareness. If you could also map the presence there to the attention schema, then this would match with the experiencer consciousness again. And the reason why I think it's a good thing to match the attention schema to the presence is that the attention schema is like a non-physical thing. It's an abstract concept, the attention schema. It doesn't exist out here in the world. And yet it's an essential part of the world in the experiencer world. The attention schema has to be there for you to be aware in the world. So that's the way in which we are present in the world, that we have an attention schema, this part of the world. So it gets a check mark there. So that's the end of my talk, and I'd like to thank you for directing your top-down attention to my presentation. And I hope that your experiencer intuitively understood how this model of consciousness explains spirituality. And please go check out my website, watch my YouTube videos, and sign up now to get notifications of new updates. And are there any questions?